Hey, AP Lang teachers, Beth Hall here from Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, I'm going to tell you 5 simple rhetorical analysis activities that you can incorporate in your instruction this school year. Before we begin, I'd like to invite you to sign up for my teacher email list. This will help you get all my best tips sent straight to your inbox. It's also how I share video links, resources, and information about upcoming teacher chats, and even information about my upcoming rhetorical analysis course launch that's happening in early July 2023. If you've watched my previous videos in this mini series, you've already heard me talk about how I like to use commercials as a way to introduce rhetorical analysis. I feel like as English teachers, we're always looking for ways to keep our instruction fun and engaging, but also relevant. And this is a great way to introduce your students to the rhetorical situation and rhetorical choices. Plus, it's a way to show them that rhetorical analysis is not just something that we have to study for the AP Lang exam, it is a skill that they can use in the real world as well. For more information about how I incorporate commercials, be sure to check out the description box below. Now let's talk about my next activity. This one is called Is It Defensible? And this one is a great way to reinforce your students' understanding of what a strong thesis statement is. It's also a really quick activity that can be adapted in many ways. I've mentioned this in a few of my other teacher tip videos, and if you have any of my rhetorical analysis resources, you might have seen this activity in there. But basically, the idea is that you present students with at least one, maybe as many as 5 thesis statements. And students have to identify, is it defensible? Yes or no? And they have to tell you why. Something else you could do is you can extend the activity by having them then write their own thesis statement. So you can do this as a Google question, you can do it as a worksheet, you can even do it digitally. It's important to remember that there might be a difference between exam standards because, quite frankly, the thesis point is pretty lenient on the exam and your own classroom standards. For instance, in my classroom, eventually we get to the point where I want to see the choices and the message, argument, or purpose. If not, I don't consider it defensible and my students don't get credit. Now, that being said, on the exam, they really just have to have those rhetorical choices. So that's what I mean by there might be a difference there. And if that's the case, please adapt the instructions to fit your students' needs and your own expectations. But in the description box below, I will link some resources. I have some pre-made activities for you to use. That way you don't have to reinvent the wheel. But again, this is a quick activity to help your students understand thesis statements, and it works great as bell work, an in-class activity, even an exit ticket. The next activity I want to tell you about is the rhetorically accurate verb sort. One of the things that I realized about my students is that they sometimes misused rhetorically accurate verbs. They thought they knew what the verb meant, but they weren't really using it as it was supposed to be used in that context. I also noticed that some of my students had a more limited vocabulary than I had expected. And so I created this activity where I gave students cards that had rhetorically accurate verbs on them. And I had them work in groups to categorize the cards, kind of like you saw in the picture on the previous slide. I wanted students to think about what the words meant and the different shades of meaning or connotations, whatever you want to call it. The great thing about this is it gets students collaborating and working together, and there's more than one way to organize the cards. It helps students by introducing them to some new vocabulary, and it really gets them thinking about, okay, what does this verb actually mean? How am I supposed to use it? I'll include a link to the activity in case you want to look at it for your students. Just as a quick note, though, there are several verbs in the activity because I wanted to basically include as many as I could think of, but you might not want to give your students all of those verbs up front. It might be overwhelming. So it's okay to select the ones that you want to use, and it's okay to adapt the activity in different ways. My students really enjoyed this, though. They said it was really fun to be able to move the pieces around on their tables and work in groups, and it helped them realize that there are more verbs out there that they could be using in their essays. One of the things that I had my students do is I had them write down their list after they had organized their cards, and that way they had that list that they could reference for future assignments as well. That way they're not just doing this activity and then forgetting the words later. It held them accountable for those verbs. This activity, silent discussions, is an annotation activity, and it is one that I'm going to be doing even more often next year. I did it once with my sophomores and once with my juniors, and they really enjoyed it. So I'd like to do it at least once in 9 weeks this coming school year. The idea behind this is that you're going to take a large piece of paper. I used two different things. One time I did it, I used wrapping paper, which worked really well because I just happened to have that in my teacher closet. Or you could also use the bulletin board paper if your school provides that for you. But you basically need a big piece of paper so that way students can write on it. And then you need to print out your passage. This is a group activity, so you're going to need enough for each group. Basically, what you do is you tape the passage to the center of the paper. That way, there's a margin for students to write in. That's that larger paper that they're writing on. In the picture, it's the purple paper. You also want to have colored pens because it helps if each person in the group has a different color. Also, for whatever reason, my students love any opportunity that I give them to use my Flair pens. I would first recommend reading the speech or watching a video. For my sophomores last year, they watched a video of a speech by President Kennedy, and it was really interesting to them to see him speak in person as opposed to us just reading the speech ourselves. So, anytime there's a video of the speech that you can show your students, that can be a great way for them to start to understand the historical connections there. My students were super surprised that in the video that I showed them, there were people in the background smoking cigars, and they were surprised at how close the people were to the president because that's not really how we do speeches today. So it can be a great way for them to kind of understand little things about the historical context that they might not have considered. So after reading the speech or listening to the speech, you're going to have students in their groups, and each student has their own colored pen, and they're going to write 3 annotations on the paper. They can write these annotations for any part of the speech. I try to encourage them to not do all of their annotations in one section, but sometimes you just kind of got to let students do what they're going to do. For this, I recommend groups of anywhere between 3 to 6 students. Honestly, for my classes, 4 students was kind of the sweet spot. And so if each student in the group is writing 3 annotations, let's say there's 4 students, then for round one, we've got 12 annotations on the paper. For the annotations, I encourage students to try to use a strong verb. I want them to think about what the speaker's doing or why he's doing it. If it's early on in the year, I'm much more open-ended with this because I want students to just engage with the text, just write something. The next round, I have students respond to 2 to 3 comments from other group members. And this is where the silent discussion comes in, as they respond by writing on the paper. You're then going to repeat steps 2 and 3 as needed and encourage students to build off of existing comments and make connections between comments. So that way we actually have a discussion going. So for instance, if I go back to this previous slide, you can see that 2 students were writing here. We have 2 different colors. And so the person who wrote in purple, that was round one. And then in round two, another student built off of that comment. And what you can't see in the picture is later on a student went and drew an arrow and connected it to a different part of the speech because they realized there were some commonalities there. So this is a great way to incorporate all students, meet them where they are. And honestly, my students who tend to be quieter really liked this because they didn't feel the pressure of having to speak up in a class discussion, but they were still able to voice their ideas. And as far as grading goes, it was more of a completion grade. That's one of the reasons why it's really helpful if each student has their own color, because I had them make a little key for me. So they signed their name and the color pen that they were using. And then I could go through and say, okay, I've seen however many comments I needed to see in this color pen. The student did a great job. The next activity I want to tell you about is using index cards for line of reasoning. There's a few different options for this. I've done it different ways. So the first option I want to tell you about is having students work in groups to write a thesis statement and topic sentence on the index cards. So you're going to read a passage as a class, and in groups of 3 to 4 students, have them work together to write a thesis statement and topic sentences. I usually require topic sentences for at least 2 body paragraphs and then a conclusion, or they can do 3 body paragraphs. That way we have all of our groups having at least 4 index cards. Then what I do is I tell them to scramble up their cards. So for this one, we don't use color-coded cards. They all have white index cards. I have a different purpose for those colored index cards. So once it's scrambled, they give it to another group, and the goal is for that group to unscramble the cards and see if they can figure out which one's the thesis, which one's the topic sentence for body paragraph one, body paragraph two. See if they can figure out the order here. Now, when I first do this with students, I give them sentence frames to help because sometimes students need to use those verbs like begins or continues or concludes. But one of the purposes of this is to help students recognize that we want to analyze chronologically. And so it helps students really focus on not only that chronological analysis, but also those transitions as well. And I'm going to be honest, when I've done this because of the sentence frames or because we've all read the same passage, there's usually no issue unscrambling the index cards. There was one time, though, where a group kind of flipped two of them, and we had a really interesting discussion as to which order it was supposed to go in and why. So the goal here is not to try to stump or trick the other group. They actually want the other group to be able to unscramble their index cards because that means they had a clear line of reasoning. For option two, you can have students write a thesis and topic sentences independently. And then what you can do is if you have colored index cards, it usually works better for this. But I choose one color for thesis statements, one color for topic sentence one color for topic sentence two. And so what I have students do is I have them select their favorite or their best sentence and write it on a card for that respective color. So let's say, for instance, thesis statements are pink. If they think their thesis is their best one, then I'll give them a pink index card. An alternative is if you don't want students to choose, you can choose for them and give them the card for the one that you think is their best. Now you might be thinking, okay, great. So they have these color coded index cards, but what do they do with them? What I did is I made a display and it had two purposes. One was I wanted students to see other students' thesis statements and topic sentences so they can learn from each other. The second reason was we were about to have our parent teacher conferences. And so, because I put it on my bulletin board, it was a quick way to show parents what we were talking about in class. Before we close this video, I wanted to let you know of a couple different ways that we can connect. Earlier on in the video, I mentioned my teacher email list, which is linked in the description box below. Also, I wanted to let you know that I have a Facebook group called the English Coaching Garden. That's a Facebook group that Tim Freitas from the Garden of English and I have put together as a way to connect with other teachers. It's not just for AP Lang teachers, it's really for secondary English. So if you're interested in that, I'll link that in the description box below. If you do try to join the group, though, please make sure that you fill out those questions that Facebook asks you. Also, I wanted to tell you very quickly about Teacher Chat. This is something that I started a couple years ago, and Tim and I have continued this together during the school year. Right now, Teacher Chat is the last Sunday of the month, and we host it on Light Hall. I will link that in the description box below. If for whatever reason it changes, for instance, if we have to switch to Zoom or if we have to change it to a different day of the month, I will announce that via my email list and my other social media platforms. But what I love about Teacher Chat is it's kind of like an online PLC. It's a way for us teachers to connect with each other and share ideas, ask questions, and learn from each other. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please do me a huge favor and give it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed. That way you don't miss any future AP Lang related content. And until next time, happy teaching!